The Darling family lived in a quiet street in London. There were Mother and Father Darling, their children Wendy, Michael and John, as well as a great St. Bernard dog called Nanny, who was the children's nursemaid. On the evening when our story begins, Nanny was sleeping peacefully by the fire, and Mr. and Mrs. Darling were getting ready to go out to a party. As the clock struck 6, Nanny knew it was time for the children to have their bath and go to bed. When Mrs. Darling came in to see the children in the bath, she heard a wee noise outside the window, as a tiny figure, no bigger than a little boy, tried the window, and vanished suddenly at her cry of surprise. She threw the window open, but there was no one to be seen. Mrs. Darling was quite sure it was Peter Pan, the little boy from Neverland, whom Wendy often talked about in her bedtime stories. Only the day before the same thing had happened, and Nanny had shut the window down so quickly she had caught Peter Pan's shadow, and this had been carefully rolled up and put away in the trunk. Suddenly Mr. Darling rushed in, very much excited, because he couldn't fasten his evening tie, and when he brushed against Nanny, and his black trousers became covered in grey clinging hairs, this made him so cross, he took Nanny by the collar, led her down to the back garden to her kennel, and tied her up. Mrs. Darling tucked the children up, sang them to sleep, then crept softly out of the room to go to the dinner party with Mr. Darling. Everything in the big nursery was now still and quiet, but not for long, as next moment there darted into the room a bright light, which flitted about and disappeared into a jug. Then the same slender figure that Mrs. Darling had seen earlier came through the window. He seemed to be looking for something, and you can guess what that was.
"Tink, where are you?" he whispered. "Have you found my shadow?"
This bright light was really a fairy, and she made a tinkling noise like a little bell. That was why she was called Tinker Bell. She flew around and at last rested on the trunk. Peter quickly opened the lid and snatched out his shadow. The trouble was, though, it wouldn't join on to him again. He even tried sticking it on with soap, but that didn't work either. The poor little fellow gave up and sat down and cried. It was then that Wendy awoke. She sat up in bed, not at all frightened, as she recognized Peter as the boy in her dreams. "Why are you crying?" she asked, and taking off his cap, Peter Pan bowed very politely and asked, "What's your name?" "Wendy Darling, and you must be Peter Pan," she replied. "Where do you live?"
"Second turning to the right and straight on till morning," said Peter Pan.
This seemed a funny address, but Wendy was full of sympathy when she heard he had no mother. Peter told her about his shadow, and straight away Wendy said, "I'll sew it on." And at once she set to work. "How old are you, Peter?"
"Oh, I don't know, but quite young. I ran away the day I was born, because I heard my father and mother talking about what I was to be when I became a man. So I ran away and lived among the fairies."
Wendy was most surprised to think that Peter knew some fairies, and she asked so many questions that he could hardly answer her fast enough. Peter suddenly remembered Tinker Bell, and he called for her. There was a tinkling of bells, and Peter, who knew the fairy language, opened the trunk, and out sprang Tinker Bell, very angry with him for shutting her up. Peter then went on to tell Wendy that he lived with the lost boys now, and they were boys who fell out of their prams when their nurses were looking the other way. If they weren't claimed within 7 days, they were sent to Neverland, and Peter was their captain.
"Before I go back," said Peter, "tell me one of your lovely stories, then I can tell the boys."
Wendy begged him to stay and promised to tell him ever so many stories. But Peter had a better idea. Wendy could return with him and be a mother to the lost boys. Oh, it was tempting to Wendy, but she couldn't fly.
"I'll teach you,"
said Peter. This was too much. "Will you teach Michael and John too?" asked Wendy, and quickly she woke her 2 brothers. Peter told them to wriggle their shoulders, think lovely thoughts, and he threw some fairy dust over them. Around the nursery they all flew, then out the window and away they floated into the dark blue depths of the starry night. Far away in the Neverland, the lost boys lived in the depths of the forest. The trees were bare without their leaves. Wolves howled and prowled in the distance. Wild beasts snarled in the undergrowth, and pirates sailed villainously up the lake, while Red Indians, who were the friends of the boys, lived secretly in their wigwams hidden in the woods. The lost boys, who, in their fur coats, looked more like bears than boys, were anxiously awaiting Peter's return. They lived like moles under the ground, and each one had a special staircase hollowed in a tree trunk, so they could run easily down among the roots of the trees into their home. They were playing happily about when one of the boys, Nibs, came rushing to tell them he'd seen a lovely white bird flying their way, and as it flew it moaned, "Poor Wendy." They all went to look, and at once saw Wendy flying through the trees in her white nightgown. Tinker Bell was pinching her all over.
"Peter wants you to shoot the Wendy,"
called Tinker Bell. She said this because she was jealous of Wendy, since she had seen Peter give her a kiss, and Tink was rather a bad little fairy sometimes. Instantly Tootles seized his bow and arrow and shot at the bird, and as he thought, Wendy fell fainting to the ground. At once the boys saw that she was no bird, but a little girl, and perhaps the very mother whom Peter had promised to bring them. They were very frightened, and soon were sure they had done a dreadful thing, for Peter came flying down with John and Michael, and asked after Wendy. "She flew this way. Haven't you seen her?" Tootles pointed to her on the ground. Peter bent over her and took the arrow, and in his anger would have killed Tootles with it, if just then Wendy hadn't moved a little. Soon she was quite well again, but so faint and tired after her long flight through the air. The boys didn't know what to do, and they didn't like to carry her down into the cave, so they decided to build a house over her, only they didn't know what kind of house. Still, half asleep, Wendy started to sing.
"I wish I had a little house, the prettiest ever seen, with walls the colour of a mouse and roof of mossy green."
So the boys fetched logs out of the forest and gathered moss and brought furniture from the underground cave. They built a beautiful home for her, and when it was finished, Peter knocked on the door. Wendy opened it and came out. The lost boys knelt before her and begged her to be their mother and tuck them in at night and tell them stories. She said that she wasn't quite sure if she could, but she'd do her best. The days passed merrily in the underground home, where Wendy was the sweetest little mother, and Peter the bravest father you could have found anywhere. On Saturday night, Wendy and the boys were all downstairs together waiting for Peter to come back from a hunting expedition. Outside, the faithful Tiger Lily and her Red Indians were keeping guard against the pirates. After Peter arrived home, the boys asked for a story before they were tucked into bed. Wendy decided to tell them their favourite one about Mrs. Darling, and this made John and Michael remember their old home, and they began to cry. Wendy decided they must go home at once, and she would take all the boys with her. The boys were as happy as larks, for now they'd have a true mother and would live in a house just like other boys. Soon they were ready to start on their journey. Peter wasn't going, though, as he wanted to stay a little boy for always, and besides, he had no time for mothers. However, he was miserable at the thought of losing Wendy. But suddenly there was a stamping overhead, and a banging and a clashing of steel, deafening screeches, yells, and war cries. The pirates had taken the Red Indians by surprise. The battle was soon over, and Peter told them the Indians would beat the Tom-Tom if they won. Captain Hook, the most fearsome pirate alive, had been listening at the chimney when Peter was speaking, and immediately had the Tom-Tom beaten.
"All will be safe," said Peter. "You can go now. Tink will show you the way."
And after saying their goodbyes, the children hurried up the stairs in the tree trunks into the forest. Unfortunately, the pirates were ready for them, and as each child came up, he was seized by a pirate and carried off to the pirate ship. Everything had been done so quietly that Peter was quite unaware of his friend's sad fate. He only knew that he was all alone. Poor Peter threw himself on his bed and cried himself to sleep. A tapping on the door woke Peter. It was Tinker Bell, and quickly she told him how Wendy and the boys had been captured by the pirates. Peter now had to save them, and following Tinker Bell, they flew off to find the pirate ship, the Jolly Roger. It was a terribly evil-looking ship, with its painted sails, and its flag with the skull and crossbones upon it. The prisoners had been all chained, so they couldn't fly away. Captain Hook had decided 6 of them could walk the plank, but he would save any 2 who were willing to be the cabin boys. Wendy was dragged up too, and quietly she spoke to the boys. However, Hook had tied her to the mast, and next thing Peter Pan had quietly come on to the ship and disappeared into a cabin. Captain Hook was tired of the silly boys by now, so he had them put away. Of course, this was just what the boys wanted. So after a while, no one saw Peter steal out, followed by the boys, who crept silently up the ladder to the higher deck. No one saw Peter cut the ropes which bound Wendy, and after a signal from Peter, he and the boys rushed forward, swinging their swords and daggers. Some of the pirates leapt overboard, leaving Captain Hook and the rest of the crew to fight for their lives. It wasn't long, though, before there was only one, Hook, and Peter Pan fighting, and then not long before Hook, too, went overboard. But at home in the Darling household all this time, there was deep sorrow. One evening, when Mr. Darling returned from his office, he went up to the nursery where Mrs. Darling was sitting, looking at the empty beds. He persuaded her to come down for dinner, and it was while they were downstairs that Wendy, John, and Michael returned to the nursery, and quietly slipped into their old beds. You can imagine Mr. and Mrs. Darling's surprise the next morning, and Mrs. Darling said of course they would look after the lost boys. Wendy hoped Peter wouldn't forget her, but after about 2 years he did. He had forgotten Hook, he had forgotten Tinker Bell, and I suppose as Wendy grew up, she too forgot Peter Pan. When Tortoise was very little, his mother said to him, "You will never go very fast. We tortoises are a slow-moving family, and though we may take longer, we do get there in the end. Don't ever try and run. Just remember, steady and slow does it." One day when he was fully grown, he was slowly walking along, minding his own business, when he saw Hare come running across the field. Hare thought he'd have some fun, so he ran round and round and round Tortoise just to annoy him. But this didn't upset Tortoise, so Hare stopped right in front of him and laughed. "Surely you can move faster than that," said Hare. "You'll never get anywhere like that. You should take a few lessons from me." Tortoise slowly lifted his head and said, "There's nowhere I really want to go, thank you, so I've no need to go hurrying around all over the place. You see, my thick shell protects me from animals that don't like me." Hare thought this would make life very dull. "But it takes you half an hour to cross one field," said Hare, "and I can be way out of sight in half a minute. Anyway, you look silly, and you ought to be ashamed of yourself." This annoyed Tortoise, and he was getting a little angry with Hare. "Now look," said Tortoise, "if it's a race you want, then I'll give you one, and I don't need to be given a start either." With that, Hare started to laugh, and he laughed so much the tears were running down his furry face, and he ended up rolling over backwards. Tortoise quietly waited until Hare had finished before saying, Well, will we have a race or won't we? I'm serious about this." By now, several other animals had gathered around, and they all said, "Go on, Hare, you'll have to race him." "Of course I will," said Hare. "Where shall we race to?" Tortoise used one of his feet to shade his eyes as he looked away across the field. "See that old barn on top of the hill over there? Well, we'll race to that. We can start from this tree here, and may the best animal win." As soon as they were both beside the tree, the rooster shouted, "On your marks, get set, go!" And Tortoise began to crawl very slowly on his way, while the other animals hurried on ahead to be at the finish. Hare just stood beside the tree watching Tortoise moving slowly across the field. It was a sunny day, and he decided to sit down and wait. He guessed it would only take him a few minutes to reach the old barn, and that was without hurrying, so there was plenty of time for him to have a sleep. After a few minutes had passed, Hare lazily opened one eye. He saw that Tortoise had hardly crossed the first field. Tortoise was saying to himself as he went along, "Steady and slow, steady and slow, that's what Mother said." "Well, at the rate he's going," thought Hare, "it will take him at least 2 hours if he doesn't drop dead on the way." And he closed his eyes again and went back to sleep. After a while, Tortoise had crossed the first field and was slowly making his way across the next, still saying to himself, "Steady and slow." The sun began to go down, and Hare woke up feeling a little cold. "What's happened?" he thought. "Where am I?" And then he remembered. He stood up and looked towards the old barn. He couldn't see Tortoise, so he jumped onto a low branch of the tree, and there he was, halfway across the last field. Hare realized he must have overslept, and he had better get a move on. So off he hurried across the first field, then the second, then the third. This was much further than he had thought. At the barn, the other animals were all waiting, and at last Tortoise arrived, very out of breath and a little shaky on his legs. "Come on, Tortoise," they shouted, and then Hare appeared at the far side of the last field, running as fast as he could. "Steady and slow," Tortoise was still saying to himself. "Come on, Tortoise," cried some of the other animals, while a few cried, "Come on, Hare, he's beating you." Hare put on extra speed and ran faster, but it was no good. He had given Tortoise too much of a start, and he still had several yards to go, while Tortoise was just crawling across the line. Tortoise had won the race. All the other animals cheered, and Hare never laughed at Tortoise again. There was once a little old man and a little old woman, and they lived together in a cottage. They had no children of their own, so one day the little old woman made a boy out of gingerbread. After the little old woman had rolled him out, dressed him, and pressed his gingerbread shoes into shape, she put him on a tray in the oven to bake. "Now," she thought, "I will have a little boy of my own." When it was time for the gingerbread boy to come out of the oven, she opened the oven door and pulled out the tray. Up jumped the little gingerbread boy onto the floor, and away he ran, out the door and down the road. The little old woman and the little old man ran quickly after him, but the boy ran so fast, and he just laughed at them and shouted,
"Run, run, as fast as you can. You can't catch me. I'm the gingerbread man."
And they couldn't catch him. The little gingerbread boy kept on running on and on, until he came to a cow who was busy eating grass at the side of the road. "Stop, little gingerbread boy," said the cow. "I want to eat you." But the little gingerbread boy just laughed and said,
"I've run away from a little old woman and a little old man, and I can run away from you, I can."
As the cow ran after him, he looked back and shouted,
"Run, run, as fast as you can. You can't catch me. I'm the gingerbread man."
And the cow couldn't catch him. Still he ran on, till he came to a horse in a paddock.
"Please stop, little gingerbread boy,"
said the horse.
"You look very nice to eat."
But the little gingerbread boy just laughed and said,
I've run away from a little old woman, a little old man, a cow, and I can run away from you, I can.
As the horse chased after him, he looked back over his shoulder and cried,
Run, run, as fast as you can. You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man.
and the horse couldn't catch him. So the little gingerbread boy kept running, and soon he came to a barn where some men were working. When they smelled the gingerbread boy, they tried to pick him up and said,
"Don't run so fast. You look very good to eat."
The little gingerbread boy ran harder than ever, and as he ran he shouted,
I've run away from a little old woman, a little old man, a cow, a horse, and I can run away from you, I can.
He turned and shouted back,
Run, run, as fast as you can. You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man.
and they couldn't catch him. The little gingerbread boy ran on faster than ever till he came to a field where some men were mowing. When they saw him, they shouted out,
"Wait a bit, little gingerbread boy. We'd like to eat you."
But the little gingerbread boy laughed louder and said,
I've run away from a little old woman, a little old man, a cow, a horse, a barn full of men, and I can run away from you, I can.
As the mowers ran after him, he looked back and cried,
Run, run, as fast as you can. You can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man.
Of course the mowers couldn't catch him. By now the little gingerbread boy was feeling very pleased with himself, and he was quite sure no one could ever catch him. So when he met a fox, he called out to him,
I've run away from a little old woman, a little old man, a cow, a horse, a barn full of men, a paddock full of mowers, and I can run away from you, I can.
The fox replied, Why should I want to catch you if I could? I wouldn't think of disturbing you. Just then the little gingerbread boy came to a wide river. He couldn't swim, and he did want to get across so he could keep running away from the cow, the horse, and all the people. Here, said the fox, jump on my tail, and I'll take you across. So the little gingerbread boy jumped onto the fox's tail, and the fox began to swim. When he was only a short way from the shore, he said, You're too heavy on my tail, little gingerbread boy, and you might get wet, so jump on my back. The little gingerbread boy jumped onto the fox's back. A little further out, the fox said, I'm very much afraid you'll get wet where you are. You'd better jump on my shoulder. The little gingerbread boy jumped onto his shoulder. When the fox had gone still further, he said, Oh dear, little gingerbread boy, now my shoulder's getting wet. If you jump onto my nose, I can definitely keep you dry there. So the little gingerbread boy jumped onto his nose. The minute the fox reached the other side of the river, he threw back his head, and his teeth went snap.
Dear me,
said the gingerbread boy,
I'm a quarter gone.
and a half-minute later,
I'm half gone.
the next minute,
I'm 3/4 gone.
and after that, he never said anything else, because he was all gone. Dorothy lived out in the great Kansas prairies with her Uncle Henry, who was a farmer, and Aunt Em. Their house was small. In fact, it was only one room. There was no garden and no cellar, except a small hole dug in the ground called a cyclone hole, where the family could go in case one of those great whirlwinds blew, strong enough to crush any building in its path. It was reached by a trapdoor in the middle of the floor. Aunt Em was unhappy here, and she couldn't understand how Dorothy could find anything to laugh about. Uncle Henry didn't ever laugh either. He just worked hard all the time. It was Toto, the little black dog, who made Dorothy laugh. One morning, Uncle Henry said,
"There's a cyclone coming."
and he rushed off to take care of his animals. Dorothy was told to run for the cellar, But by the time she had caught Toto, there came a great shriek from the wind, and then a strange thing happened. The house whirled around 2 or 3 times and rose slowly through the air. It was carried miles and miles away as easily as you could carry a feather. It was very dark, and the wind howled horribly, but Dorothy was all right. Hour after hour passed, and Dorothy was feeling quite lonely now, so she and Toto crawled onto her bed and went to sleep. She was awakened by a shock so sudden and severe, Dorothy was lucky she wasn't hurt. The house wasn't moving any more, and the sun was shining in the window. Dorothy sprang from her bed, and with Toto at her heels, ran and opened the door. She could see she was in the middle of the most beautiful country, and coming towards the house was a group of the queerest people. They were very small and looked quite old. A little old woman said, "You are welcome, most noble sorceress, to the land of the Munchkins. Thank you for killing the wicked witch of the East and setting our people free." Dorothy didn't know what on earth the woman was talking about, and she told them there must be some mistake, as she hadn't killed anyone. "Well, your house did," said the little old woman with a laugh, and pointed to where 2 toes stuck out under one corner of the house. Dorothy was most upset, but the little old woman said the Munchkins were very happy. They were the people who lived in this land. Well, that was fine, but Dorothy thought she should really be getting back to Kansas. The Munchkins hadn't heard of that, but they suggested she go to the Emerald City and ask Oz, the great wizard, how to get home. It was all so confusing, as they told her there were 4 witches in all the land of Oz. 2 were wicked and 2 were kind. Of course, Dorothy had just killed one of the wicked witches. The little old woman, who was actually the kind witch of the north, gave a shriek and pointed to the corner of the house. The wicked east witch had dried up in the sun, and only her silver shoes were left. They gave these to Dorothy and told her there was a special charm attached to them, but no one knew what it was. Changing into them, Dorothy told the Munchkins it was time she and Toto were on their way to see the great Oz, and how was she to get to the Emerald City. She was to follow the yellow paved brick road, and this she did. The countryside was very pretty, but towards evening Dorothy was tiring, and she was pleased to find a big house where she was invited for supper and to stay the night. Next morning she asked how far it was to the Emerald City, but no one knew, except that it was many days, and she would have to pass through rough and dangerous places. She set off, but she and Toto hadn't gone far when they met a scarecrow. He told them he was tired of being thought a fool with no brain, and maybe the great Oz might fix him. So off they went, and by they came to a forest. It was very dark and scary, but soon they reached a cottage, and here they stayed the night. The sun was shining when Dorothy awoke, and they went to find water, as she wanted to wash her face, and Toto was thirsty. It was by the stream they came across the Tin Man. He was groaning away because his joints were all rusted. While Dorothy oiled him all over, she told him where they were going, and the Tin Man, who was a woodcutter, asked if the great Oz would give him a heart. "Why, I guess so," said Dorothy. "Come with us and see." Off they went down the yellow paved brick road. Next thing, a great lion bounded out in front of them, and with one blow of his paw he sent the scarecrow spinning over and over to the side of the road. Then he struck the tin woodcutter, but he couldn't make any impression on him, although he fell over. Toto ran, barking, and Dorothy, afraid for her little dog, rushed forward and slapped the lion on the nose as hard as she could. She was cross with the lion, and told him so. In fact, he was nothing but a big coward. They told him they were going to the Great Oz, and the lion decided he would go too, as he might be given courage. Once more the little company set off upon the journey. They were obliged to camp out that night under a large tree in the forest, and when it was daylight they started toward the Emerald City. The road was smooth and well paved by now, and they realized Everywhere they looked, everything was green. The fences, the houses, and even the people.
"This must be the land of Oz," said Dorothy, "and we're surely getting near the Emerald City."
Indeed they were, for there in front of them was a big gate. It was all studded with emeralds that glittered in the sun. There was a bell beside the gate which Dorothy pushed. Slowly the big gate opened, and they found themselves in a high arched room. A little man, dressed all in green and with greenish skin, stood inside the gate. He asked them what they wished in Emerald City. The little man was most surprised to hear they had come to see the Great Oz, as it had been many years since anyone had asked that. And did they realize he was powerful and terrible, and he might destroy them all if their errand was foolish? Dorothy felt their errand was most important, so the little man agreed to escort them to the palace, but first they had to put green spectacles on, or the brightness of Emerald City might blind them. Taking a big golden key from a peg on the wall, the little man opened another gate, and there they were in Emerald City. What a sight it was! The streets were lined with beautiful houses, all built of green marble, the pavements too, and the window panes were of green glass. Men, women, and children were all dressed in green, and everything in the shop windows was green, even the candy and popcorn. On to the palace they went, and here they were shown into a large room with green carpet and green furniture. A soldier took their message to the throne room, and after waiting a long time, he returned to tell them the Great Oz would see them, but one at a time, and only one a day. This meant staying in the palace, so they were shown to their rooms. The next morning, it was Dorothy who was taken to the throne room first. After a bell rang, she opened a door and found herself in a wonderful place. As you guessed, everything was green, and in the middle of the room stood a big throne of green marble. In the centre of the throne was an enormous head, without a body or any arms or legs. There was no hair upon the head, but it had eyes, a nose, and mouth. The head itself was bigger than the head of the biggest giant. The eyes turned slowly and stared at Dorothy.
"I'm Oz, the great and terrible. Who are you, and why do you wish to see me?"
Dorothy told him she needed help.
"Where did you get the silver shoes?"
said the voice. And Dorothy explained how her house had fallen on the Wicked Witch of the East.
"Where did you get the mark on your forehead?"
Well, that was where the Good Witch of the North had kissed her goodbye, Dorothy told him. The Great Oz then asked what she wanted him to do, and quickly Dorothy told him that she wanted to return to her Uncle Henry and Aunt Em in Kansas, as they'd be dreadfully worried about her. When the Great Oz asked why he should do this for her, Dorothy just told him it was because he was strong, she was weak, he was a great wizard, and she a helpless little girl. So the Great Oz said that if Dorothy killed the Wicked Witch of the West, he might help her. Poor Dorothy, who had never killed anything willingly before, left the throne room most upset. Next morning, the Scarecrow was admitted to the throne room, and he was told to kill the Wicked Witch of the West if he wanted his wish granted. But he was told by a most lovely lady, which surprised Dorothy when she heard. So the next morning it was the Tin Woodcutter's turn to go to the throne room. He met a most horrible beast, and if he wanted a heart, then he must kill the Wicked Witch of the West. By now they were all very puzzled at the many forms of the great wizard. Off went the lion the next morning, and to his surprise there was a great wall of fire around the throne, and he too was told to kill the Wicked Witch of the West. What a problem they had! But the sooner they started, the sooner it might be done. They had no idea how to find her, but they were told that when they reached the land of the Winkies, she'd find them, and that's exactly what happened. In fact, some horrible things happened on that journey, but they did kill the Wicked Witch of the West, and she melted away. The Winkies were delighted to be free again, and gave each of them a present. Once again they all set off for the Emerald City, and again rang the bell at the gate. After being taken to the palace, they were informed that the great Oz would see them the next morning. After hearing the news, he told them to come back the next day.
"You must keep your promise to us," said Dorothy.
The Lion thought it might be as well to give the wizard a fright, and he gave a loud roar. Toto jumped away in fright and accidentally knocked over a screen. There stood a little old man with a bald head and wrinkled face, who seemed as much surprised as they were. "Who are you?" they cried.
"I'm Oz, the great and terrible," he said in a trembling voice. "But please don't hit me. I'll do anything you want me to."
So it was just humbug, and all those years the great Oz had been pretending and making everyone afraid of him. He wasn't even a good wizard. However, he would try and give the Scarecrow brains, although he didn't need them, and he was learning every day. As for the Lion, he had plenty of courage. He just needed confidence in himself, and the Tin Woodcutter was better off without a heart. Still, he would see what he could do, but he'd have to think about Dorothy, and he made them all promise not to say one word of what had happened. Dorothy was to go home in a balloon, and after working on the others, Oz made a balloon and asked her if he could go along too. Just as they were due to leave, Toto chased after a kitten, and by the time Dorothy had caught him, Oz and the balloon had risen into the air, and that was the last they saw of him. Dorothy wept bitterly, and Scarecrow, who'd been made ruler of Emerald City, decided they should all help her get home somehow, as it was due to her that they had all had what they wanted. So once more the travellers left through the gates of Emerald City, and after many exciting adventures they arrived at the castle of the kind Witch of the South. They explained everything to her and asked if she could get Dorothy home to Kansas. "What will you all do when she leaves?" asked the kind witch. Well, Scarecrow, of course, would return to rule the Emerald City, and the Tin Woodcutter had been asked by the Winkies to be their ruler. As for the Lion, he had met other lions on this last journey, and they wanted him to be their king. The kind witch could see everyone but Dorothy was happy, so she told Dorothy that if she knocked the heels of the silver shoes together 3 times, she could command the shoes to carry her wherever she wished. Quickly Dorothy thanked the witch, said goodbye to her friends, and picking up Toto, clapped the heels of her shoes together 3 times, saying,
"Take me home to Aunt Em."
Instantly she was whirling through the air so swiftly, and she only took 3 steps before she stopped suddenly and rolled over and over on the grass. Somewhere on the flight she had lost the silver shoes. There in front of her stood a new farmhouse, and she could see Uncle Henry milking the cows and Aunt Em watering the cabbages. She called out, and Aunt Em came running to her, and taking Dorothy in her arms, asked where on earth she had been.
"To the land of Oz,"
said Dorothy.
"But Toto and I am so glad to be home again."
There were once 2 sisters who lived in a pretty cottage with their mother. They were called Snow White and Rose Red, after the 2 rose bushes which grew on either side of the front door of their cottage. They were good and happy girls, and they helped their mother keep their cottage neat and tidy. Snow White was quiet and gentle, while Rose Red would run and jump in the meadows, catching butterflies and picking flowers. The 2 children loved one another and always walked hand in hand when they went out together. Often they would play in the forest with their friends, the goats, the fawns, and all the other wild animals. Even the birds didn't fly away when the children passed near to them. Each morning in the summer-time, Rose Red would tidy the house and then go out and gather flowers for her mother, while every winter's morning Snow White would light the fire and put the kettle on. In the evening after dark, Snow White would lock the door and they'd settle down in front of the fire. Their mother would put on her spectacles and read to them out of a big book, while the girls sat at their spinning wheels. One evening, as they were all busy, they heard a loud knocking on the door. "Quickly, Rose Red," said her mother. "Hurry and open the door. There may be a traveller outside who needs food and shelter." When Rose Red opened the door, there stood a great fluffy bear. Rose Red shrieked, and Snow White hid herself behind her mother's chair.
"Don't be frightened. I won't hurt you," said the bear. "I only want to come in and warm myself, as it's very cold out here. I'm really very gentle and kind," he added. "Poor bear," cried the mother. "Come in and warm yourself by our fire." The children came over to look at him, and he said, "Would you please sweep the snow off my fur before I come into this large room?" So they each fetched a broom and swept the snow off him until he was black all over. The bear stretched out in front of the fire, and after a little while the children were no longer frightened, and they began to stroke his fur. When it was bedtime, the mother told the bear he could stay where he was, which he was glad to do. The next morning the two children let the bear out, and away over the snow he trotted. From then on he came to them every evening at the same time, and slept by the fire. He became a real friend to Snow White and Rose Red, and they were able to play with him as much as they liked. When spring came, though, it was time for the bear to move on. When they asked him where he was going, he told them it was time to go into the forest to guard his treasure from the wicked dwarfs, as they were always wanting to steal it, and if they did that, it would be difficult to get it back. The children were sorry to see him go, as they had grown very fond of him. Some days later, the mother sent the children into the wood to gather sticks for the fire, and while doing this, they came to a tree lying across the path. Beside the tree was an ugly old dwarf with a long white beard. He was jumping up and down, and they noticed the tip of his beard was caught in a branch.
"Don't just stand there and stare, you stupid children," he shouted. "Help me."
They tried to. Then Rose Red said she'd go and get help, but that wasn't necessary because Snow White had a pair of scissors in her pocket, and she snipped off the end of the beard. The ugly dwarf didn't even say thank you. He just picked up his sack of gold and went off grumbling about those silly children who had cut off a piece of his beautiful beard. Later that day, Snow White and Rose Red went fishing, and there by the pond they saw the dwarf again. This time his beard was tangled in his fishing line, and a big fish was dragging him nearer and nearer to the water. He would have drowned if Snow White's scissors hadn't been used again to free him.
"You fool!" he cried. "Now you've completely ruined my beard and spoiled my good looks," he cried, and picking up his sack filled with precious stones this time, he strode away. The children hoped they would never see him again. A few days passed, and their mother decided to send them to town shopping, and on their way they saw a great bird flying lower and lower. Next they heard a piercing shriek, and running quickly they saw the bird had pounced on the nasty old dwarf, and it was trying to carry him away. The girls grabbed at the little man, and soon the bird gave up. "Oh, you silly children! You've torn my fine new coat," said the ungrateful dwarf. "Why are you always interfering?"
And he strode off. When the girls passed the same place on their way home from shopping, they saw the dwarf sitting beside a flat rock like a table, and on it he had spread all his treasure. The dwarf was furious when he noticed the girls watching him, but before he could say anything there was a loud roaring noise, and a great black bear came rolling through the trees.
"Spare me, dear bear," said the dwarf, "and you can have all my treasure. I'm too small to eat, but these wicked girls will make a fine meal for you."
The bear didn't answer, and with a single blow he knocked the dwarf down, and he never moved again.
"Don't run away, girls,"
called the bear.
"Don't you remember me, Snow White and Rose Red?"
Suddenly his rough coat fell off, leaving a tall man dressed in gold. "I am a king's son, and that wicked dwarf cast a spell on me, turning me into a bear. Then he stole all my treasure," said the prince. He had to wander the forest until the dwarf was dead, as that was all that would set him free and turn him back into a prince. The children were so pleased to see their friend again, and they hurried home with him to tell their mother the whole story. Not many years later, Snow White married the prince. His brother married Rose Red, and they shared the treasure between them. The wedding was a very gay affair, and after, the mother lived happily with her children in the palace, where they had planted the 2 rose bushes, one white and one red, that had grown beside the cottage door. There were once 3 billy goats who were to go up the hillside to the green grass for their lunch. To get up the hill, they had to cross a bridge, and under the bridge lived an ugly old troll with eyes as big as saucers and a nose as long as a poker. The youngest billy goat Gruff was the first to cross the bridge.
"Who's that tripping over my bridge?"
roared the troll.
"Oh, it's only I, the youngest billy goat Gruff, and I'm going up the hill to the lovely green grass to have my lunch," said the billy goat in a rather small voice.
"Well, I'm coming to gobble you up,"
said the troll.
"Oh, no, please don't eat me. I'm too little, I am," said the billy goat. "Besides, the second billy goat's coming soon, and he's much bigger."
"Then be off with you,"
said the troll. After a while, along came the second billy goat Gruff to cross the bridge.
"Who's that tripping over my bridge?"
roared the troll. "Oh, it's I, the second billy goat Gruff, and I'm coming up the hill to the lovely green grass to have my lunch," said the billy goat in a not-so-small voice.
"Well, I'm coming to gobble you up,"
said the troll. "Oh, no, don't eat me. Why don't you wait for the big billy goat Gruff? He's much bigger."
"Very well, then, be off with you,"
said the troll. Just then, up came the big billy goat Gruff. The bridge groaned and creaked under him as he was so heavy.
"Who's that tramping over my bridge?"
roared the troll. "It's I, the big billy goat Gruff," said the billy goat, who had a very big voice of his own.
"Well, I'm coming to gobble you up,"
roared the troll. "Then come along. I've got 2 horns, and I'll poke your eyes out through your ears. Besides, I've got 2 big stones, and I'll crush you to little bits, body and bones." That was exactly what the billy goat said, and so he flew at the troll and poked his eyes out with his horns, then crushed his body and bones to bits and tossed him in the river. After that, he went on up the hillside, and there the 3 billy goats Gruff ate so much grass and got so fat they could hardly walk home.